Good morning. Apophaticism is usually defined as the via negativa, negative theology, a method for describing God by negation of obtaining knowledge of God through negative concepts and or of stressing the ineffability of the divine. However, I will not deal with these aspects. It is usually thought to be in the domain of mystical tradition. The question of whether such a conceptualization of apophaticism is accurate is beyond the scope of this paper, although it has to be stated that, for example, in Maximus the Confessor's writings and in a number of other patristic authors, apophatic descriptions emerge as anything but subjective mystical experiences, and anything but is a good phrase to start a definition of apophaticism. Quite the contrary, they emerge as a theologically and perhaps philosophically technical and robust language that forms the precondition in order to qualify any cataphatic description, not only of God necessarily, but of everything in a certain sense. Much has been written on apophaticism and postmodernism, often in a critical vein that reduces apophaticism to nothing more than a narrowly understood via negativa. And it has been noted that many of these discussions have drawn inspiration from the work of Derrida, who himself, while genuinely intrigued by Christian apophaticism, has not been without critical reserve. In this paper, I will focus on apophaticism in contemporary postmodern philosophy, yet not on the contemporary philosophical reception of apophaticism in general, but on thinkers that develop apophatic impulses into wider schemata that go beyond God himself and lay claim to core areas of philosophy. Instead of attempting an exhaustive survey of such thinkers, I will take two academic philosophers with a keen interest in and important contributions to theology as two case studies, Jean-Luc Marion and Christos Yannaras. It just so happens that one of them is Roman Catholic, while the other Eastern Orthodox. Both of them elevate apophaticism into something considerably more wide-encompassing than a mere method, a language, a stance, or a via negativa for describing the Godhead. Both of them elevate apophaticism into a core element of their respective philosophies, something which has not eluded the attention of scholars authoring monographs on them. For example, Tamsin Jones has written Apparent Darkness, Jean-Luc Marion's retrieval of the Greek apophatic tradition, while Basilio Petra, Christos Yannaras, the apophatic horizon of ontology. I would like to propose that Yannaras formulates apophaticism as a philosophical epistemology of its own, while Marion as a non-ontotheological and phenomenological ontology. So one of them has an epistemology, an apophatic epistemology, the other an apophatic ontology. Although this distinction is made here for the sheer convenience of the present discussion, as for both Marion and Yannaras, apophaticism is both the precondition of any ontology and the prerequisite for an epistemology. While they have developed their thinking independently of each other, and while their philosophies have many important differences between them, it is interesting to note that both Marion's God Without Being and Yannaras' Heidegger and the Areopagite have a certain in them a certain common impulse is clearly discernible in their employment of apophatic thinking. They both seek to respond to the challenges raised by Nietzsche's Death of God and its aftermath via an engagement with Martin Heidegger's philosophy and a re-examination of patristic authors such as the Corpus Dionysiacum, Gregory of Nyssa, and others. Now, concerning Marion, in my brief introduction, I shall focus on his God Without Being. Jean-Luc Marion does not explicitly describe his exposition as an apophatic one there, although he does in other contexts. However, and apart from, it is precisely with the publication of this book that he consolidates his position as one of the most significant Christian apophaticists of postmodernity, as has been written. In this book, Marion takes God as the starting point of his inquiry. While theoretically, then, the discourse focuses on God, on what can and what cannot be said of him. However, it is indeed the case that this God, implicitly yet decisively, and in spite of resisting every ontotheological configuration, continues to be the ontological grounding of created existence, if not for any other reason, then precisely because the world, creation, and everything, and God is not part of everything, is not causa sui, is not a cause of itself. The fact that the world itself is to be seen as a gift entails that the question concerning the one who freely and out of love grants this gift is indeed the prerequisite for any ontology concerning the world. Thus, Marion's examination of God, or God without being, is unavoidably the prerequisite for Marion's ontology. We see here Apophaticism being deployed as a first philosophy. By the way, for those of you that may not be familiar with this particular terminology, by ontotheology we mean the tendency of metaphysics to include God as one of the beings, the highest of the beings, yet within the order of beings, this being, as it were, an affront to both Christian theology and to philosophy. So Marion seeks to ground a non-ontotheological theology, not simply by reiterating that the God of the Christian tradition is neither one of the beings nor the highest being, nor by clarifying that among the divine names none exhausts God or offers the grasp or hold of a comprehension of Him. The divine names have strictly no other function than to manifest this impossibility. However, he does this by delving deeper and radically differentiating God, or rather, as he formulates the non-ontotheological God in orthography, God with the O crossed out, as it were, both from beings and from the Heideggerian being, which in turn is not one of the beings and is certainly not God. He writes, ontological difference, almost indispensable to all thought, presents itself thus as a negative propedetic of the unthinkable thought of God. It is the ultimate idol. Marion begins by seeking to demonstrate that any discourse that reifies God by necessity replaces God with a conceptual idol. He writes, when a philosophical thought expresses a concept of what it then names God, this concept functions exactly as an idol. It gives itself to be seen, but thus all the better conceals itself as the mirror. The conceptual idols of metaphysics culminate in the causa sui, as Heidegger indicates, only insofar as the figures of ontotheology have all undertaken to consign to a concept the ultimate low-water mark of their advance towards the divine. And after that, after Plato and Aristotle, towards the Christian God, end of quote. Apart from what could be described as an odious misconception, however, the ontological and ontotheological problem in articulating the question, does God exist, or symmetrically to the affirmation that God does exist, God is, an idolatrous affirmation in Marion's context, is that the primacy in the very logical syntax of this question belongs to exist rather than to God. God exists to the extent that God is, as it were, successfully subjected to the criteria that existing sets forth, criteria that emerge from our world of beings and being itself. Being says nothing about God that God cannot immediately reject, Marion writes. Whence comes the decision that God has to be like a being that being with capital B manifests, that is manifested according to being with capital B? Does the name of the God who is crossed out because he is crucified belong to the domain of being? A God that is, a God that exists in this context, is not the uncreated world of the Christian Church. Marion writes, to the thought that is attached to thinking being as being outside of metaphysics, in the definite confrontation with ontological difference medicated as such, the question of the existence of God inevitably will appear misplaced, hasty and imprecise. Imprecise, for what does it mean to exist? And is this term suitable to something like God? What is essential in the question of the existence of God stems less from God than from existence itself, therefore from being. Thus, in the end, this question appears misplaced, at once unsuitable and dislodged from its proper side. The truth on God could never come but from where truth itself issues, namely from being as such, from its constellations and its opening. End of quote. It is crucial to reiterate here that Marion's thought is not merely apophatic in the first level type of the via negativa, of insisting on what cannot be said of God, and on the negative yet conceptual formulations that emerge, as for example, unthinkable. This is a negative formulation, what cannot be thought. Echoing a certain patristic insistence in avoiding to literally ascribe to God any trait that has its opposite, and thus all narrowly defined apophatic non-descriptions as well, as pairs of opposite characterize the created order, Marion demonstrates that even characterizing God as unthinkable, indirectly turns God into a cataphatic idol and is not enough, as declaring God unthinkable simply renders God a thinkable object of our thought under the label of unthinkable. Marion writes, concerning God, let us admit clearly that we can think him only under the figure of the unthinkable, but of an unthinkable that exceeds as much what we cannot think as what we can. For that which I may not think is still the concern of my thought, and hence to me remains thinkable. Thus, the unthinkable determines God by the seal of his definitive indeterminateness for a created and finite thought. So the debate is not settled simply by declaring God to be unthinkable. A more radical gesture is required. The unthinkable, writes Marion, forces us to substitute the idolatrous quotation marks around God with the very God that has no mark of knowledge can demarcate. And in order to say that, let us cross out the O in God with a cross provisionally of St. Andrew, which demonstrates the limit of the temptation, conscious or naive, to blaspheme the unthinkable in an idol. The cross does not indicate that God would have to disappear as a concept or intervene only in the capacity of hypothesis in the process of validation, but that the unthinkable enters into the field of our thought only by rendering itself unthinkable there by excess, that is, by criticizing our thought. To cross out God, in fact, indicates and recalls that God crosses out our thought because he saturates it. Better, he enters into our thought only in obliging it to criticize itself. The crossing out of God we trace on this written name only because first he brings it to bear on our thought as his unthinkableness. We cross out the name of God only in order to show ourselves that his unthinkableness saturates our thought right from the beginning and forever. End of quote. However, Marion is not content with demonstrating what cannot be said, as we said before, as for example when he concludes that God is expressed neither as a being nor as being, nor by an essence. He traces in the Gospel of God's definition, as it were, of God as love, as agape, a way out of conceptual idolatry. As Marion traces in love and in the function of freely giving of the gift, a mode of existence that cannot be constrained by any set of prerequisites for existing and being, terms that would otherwise acquire primacy over the love that God is. In the distance, he writes, only love, agape, can put everything on earth, in heaven and in hell, in giving, because agape alone, by definition, is not known, but gives itself. What allows that God should be God consists more radically than in being, in loving. If, on the contrary, God is not because he does not have to be, but loves, then by definition, no condition can continue to restrict his initiative, amplitude, and ecstasy. Love loves without condition, simply because it loves. He thus loves without limit or restriction. Much of God without being is dedicated to showing how this love discloses a God that is beyond existing being and the Heideggerian being, and how this love renders God participable, for in order to accomplish the response to love, it is necessary and sufficient to will it, since will alone can refuse or receive, so that man cannot impose any condition, even negative, on the initiative of God. Thus, no aim can any longer decide idolatrously on the possibility or impossibility of access to and from God. This God who reveals himself has nothing in common, at least in principle, with the God of the philosophers, of the learned, and eventually of the poet. Marion writes, space does not allow for a fuller exposition. What needs to be reiterated, however, is that apart from this argument being a theology, it is indeed an ontology, or rather the prerequisite for an ontology, since even this crossed out God continues to be the ontological grounding of created existence, precisely because as created existence does not form the cause of itself, but it points to its source. Marion is much more concerned with the implications of his non-ontotheological theology for us and the world, that is, with the ontology that stems from the disclosure of being as a gift and from the cause of this gift as love, rather than as a being, than with elaborating on the non-being of a God without being. Thus, his apophaticism is truly the cornerstone of his ontology of the world, of our world, the world of being and beings. Now concerning and by the way, if this seems very unpatristic to many, one recalls certain passages, for example, by Maximus the Confessor, stressing that God is more properly to be described as meon, non-being, because he's not one of the beings, etc., but to be more concrete, he's beyond both those characterizations. Maximus is full of such very Marion-like passages. Now, Christos Yannaras does not primarily engage with apophaticism as a discourse for describing the ineffable God, although this was the starting point in his first monograph on Heidegger and the Areopagite in the 60s. In an axis permeating the totality of his oeuvre, Yannaras presents the apophaticism he traces in Greek tradition, Christian and classical alike, as an all-encompassing epistemological stance, a criterion of knowledge that may be defined as follows. 1, the denial that we exhaust knowledge in its formulation. 2, the refusal to identify the understanding of the signifiers with the knowledge of what is signified. And 3, the symbolic character of every epistemic expression, its role in bringing together individual experiences and embracing them within a common semantic boundary marker, a process which allows epistemic experience to be shared and once shared to be verified. In what is rather a bold claim, Yannaras sees in apophaticism a tendency and an epistemological stance of the whole of the Greek tradition, even from the time of Heraclitus, in fragments such as, "For if we are in communion with each other, we are in truth, but if we exist privately, we are in error," to that of Gregory Palamas. According to him, formulations of truth can only refer to the signified truth of knowledge, not exhaust it. By coming to know the formulations that refer to truth, one does not know truth. Truth can only be lived, experienced, and as such is not static. There is a gap of crucial cognitive importance between the signifier and its signified reality. In an apophatic epistemology, the individual cannot conceive truth individually as a finite formulation, and this leads to the communal verification of knowledge that is the other aspect of Yannaras' apophaticism. Truth lies in the field of experience, and more specifically in shared experience, because, as Yannaras writes, there is no relation that does not constitute an experience, and there is no experience not arising from a relation or establishing a relation. Relation is the foundational mode of the human logical subject, the way in which man exists, knows, and is known. Truth can only be attained in this context through shared experience, communed experience, lived in communion, and cannot be confined to finite formulations. This excludes the possibility of a priori truths, prescribed doctrines and axiomatic theories that are not circulated, as it were, in shared experience in actual communities. Yannaras writes, communed experience and not the accuracy of the individual's intellectual faculty verifies knowledge, even if proper communion of experience presupposes the accuracy of intellectual faculties. The signifiers allow us to share our common reference to reality and experience, but cannot replace the cognitive experience itself. This obvious difference can only then be understood when the criterion of the critical function is the communal verification of knowledge. For example, if a person has not known a mother because his mother has died at birth, for example, a person can memorize and understand a number of definitions on what motherly love is, but actual knowledge of that reality is beyond that person's scope by definition. So in that example, the difference between intellectual knowledge and the access to actual reality is underscored. Yannaras now makes a distinction between an apophaticism of the essence and an apophaticism of the person. This distinction reflects not simply a methodological distinction, but an insurmountable contrast on the level of ontology as well as epistemology, he claims. Apophaticism of essence means that I choose the individual conceptual capacity as the basis for my knowledge of experience. Consequently, I come to know what exists as perfect entities predetermined by the principle of their given essence, which I rationally conceive. When this essence, moreover, is taken to be uncreated, transcendent, and supernatural, I grant that I may conceive the existence of such a being, but I do not know its reality. So, confessing that one would not know its reality would be an apophaticism of the essence. Apophaticism of the person for Yannaras means that I start from the discovery that my experience and the knowledge that I have, the way that I exist and the way that I know, are facts of accomplished relationships, relations with the world. And relationship is not exhausted by conceptual analysis, but is a universal existent fact that is divided up into a multitude of faculties of apprehension: the sensory, the critical, the abstractive, the analytic, the imaginative, the emotional, the intuitive, the conceptual or verbal. the visionary, and probably others. No intellectual definition, whether conceptual or verbal, can ever exhaust the knowledge afforded to us by the immediacy of relationship. Consequently, the logical definition of essence, as the common principles of examples of the same form, follows and does not precede the otherness of each existent, which I know in immediate relation with it. So we see here that it is Yannaras' apophaticism that dictates a communal epistemology, a communal verification of knowledge, and a certain priority of the hypostasis over the essence, a certain ontological priority in that. Thus, if God exists, he is primarily known as a person, hypostasis, in the immediacy of relationship, and not primarily as an essence with its conceptual definition. And given the inadequacy of reason to replace or exhaust the cognitive immediacy of relatedness, particularly as regards the hypostasis of the person, where otherness is not simply phenomenological, but the freedom of the subject's self-determination of its mode of existence, we may speak of the apophatic character of any definition that is given of the personal otherness of God. So, for Yannaras, apophatic epistemology, again, the refusal to exhaust truth in its formulations and the refusal to identify the understanding of the signifier with a knowledge of its signified reality, lies beyond this polarization between cataphaticism and via negativa, and beyond a choice of negations rather than affirmations. It is based on, as he writes, the symbolic character of every epistemic expression. Apophaticism sees language as referring to truth and reality, signifying reality and iconizing it, while not exhausting it. It is not negation, but the signifying semantic function that characterizes the relationship between language and reality in such an understanding. As such, language is not an obstacle hindering us from achieving an individualistic mystical knowledge, but a medium to share, to commune knowledge and truth, and an attempt at a communal participation to it. This elevates this communal verification of knowledge to a criterion of knowledge itself for Yannaras. For him, every ontological system or statement presupposes and is based on the epistemology on which it is built, be that implicit or explicit, on the criteria through which knowledge is considered as valid or invalid. That is why, he remarks, we conclude from history that a common epistemology incorporated in the everyday life of the people, and not a common ontology, constitute a common culture, that is the otherness of a common way of life. It is not the content we attribute to truth, but it is the way in which cognitive validity is confirmed that confers otherness in sharing public life, identity of culture, and ensures the historical continuity of that cultural otherness. He theorizes that the philosophical continuity of a culture is premised not on the seamless continuity in ontology, but on a continuity in epistemology. Well, and perhaps this is what drives him to project continuity onto the Greek tradition, as its ontology obviously changed from the classical and pagan times to the Christian era, yet for Yannaras, and according to him, without a rupture in its implicitly apophatic stance towards knowledge. In this context, the criterion of the apophatic and communal validation of knowledge is a crucial prerequisite for the understanding of, for Yannaras, both classical ontology and early Christian ontology as well. He asks in a book precisely on the relationship of language with reality, the effable and the ineffable, which claims to be in dialogue with Wittgenstein's philosophy. What is an effective alternative to the autonomy of comprehension, to the epistemic self-sufficiency of comprehension? What mode of comprehension is not restricted to the correct intellectual reception and usage of linguistic signifiers, but also confirms the reality of non-reality or non-reality of the signifieds? What could secure or direct access to knowledge of reality via signifiers? What is the means by which to distinguish the existent from the non-existent? What is real from intellectual idols? Relation is the only feasible answer for Yannaras. The relational event, relational experiences, the epistemic immediacy of experienced relations. In the perspective of ecclesial apophaticism, experiential access to and relationship with the signifieds of metaphysical semantics cannot be attained purely by individual effort. Access is mediated by participation in the ecclesial mode of being, and that kind of personal and loving relational communion that forms the body of the Eucharistic community. Only by experiencing ecclesial relational communion can one progressively attain some indirect knowledge through a mirror, dimly, of what is signified by words like person, personal hypostasis, life-giving activity, grace, love, and freedom. This apophatic epistemology, this communal epistemology, end of quote, this apophatic epistemology, this communal epistemology refers the possibility of existence in truth, not in the individual level, but in the field of the relations between logical othernesses, relations that manifest the other in these othernesses. By the way, this also entails the political element of Yannaras' thought, because if truth is a communal event, then the question of the constitution of this polity of the community is to be put forth. The most suitable term for the will to relate, not as a quality of the individual, but as a way of being, a mode of existence, is eros for Yannaras. If valid knowledge and truth can only be attained through a self-transcendent relation with existence, then the mode of truly existing is the transcendental relation, eros. So it is even our access to knowledge that is attained only in imago Dei. We can have knowledge only to the extent that we can participate in something as the mode of existence of God, that is love, agape, and in the corpus Dionysiacum, eros. So to conclude, we saw in this brief survey that Apophaticism has been picked up by postmodern, theologically informed philosophical work in both East and West, not merely as the via negativa, and much less as a mystical or subjective route to knowledge, or as a statement to the effect of the impossibility of acquiring it. Rather than that, it has been developed into the basis for ontological and epistemological theories that combine the rich tradition of the past in terms of theological thought with contemporary philosophical sensibilities, in ways that forcibly refute the average dictionary definition of apophaticism. By the way, this happens within the context of the discipline formerly known as philosophy, now labeled continental philosophy. In this, we may see the development of elements of our contemplative traditions in rather unexpected ways, and the future prospects for further developments in domains beyond academic theology proper. Thank you very much.